All right, so we're going to round out our discussion today of atomic habits. Cover the last little bit of stuff we haven't covered so far. Are you feeling good about wrapping up atomic habits?
Yeah, that'll be great.
Are you ready to argue some more?
Well, I don't think we're going to argue. I think we're supposed to agree on most things.
People are coming to listen to us to hear us argue. They're not here to hear us agree about stuff.
I don't know if that's true or not.
There you go. That's the spirit. Disagree.
Anyways, so starting off, we're going to finish everything out. I don't even know if we recorded the proper outro last time, but we'll get around to that. In this case, we're going to complete Atomic Habits. This will be the second and last part of that. As always, I'm Joel Serrano. That's Leo Serrano. And this is Deep Dive Book Club podcast.
There you go. Good job.
So, where we last left off, we went through the first half of the book, and we're going to complete the second half. And I think, do you want to start and take this off?
Yeah, so I'm looking through, the copious notes and materials that we've got left over from the war zone of going through this book. And I think one of the things we talked about last time, the destination versus the journey. And I think a good follow-up to that is something that James Clear talks about. You can make a habit pretty much out of anything, but some people are going to find it easier to make a habit out of certain things than others. And a lot of that has to do with what you're naturally good at, what your genetic strengths are. What's that look?
What?
What's
I'm
that
listening.
Look? What are your thoughts? Go ahead. What are you thinking?
I want you to finish your statement first.
Well, that was basically it. You make habits based off your strengths. I've got more to talk about, but go ahead. What's your cute little thought you got over there?
I was just happy to listen to you go through this.
And had a shit-eating grin.
I agree with James Clear in this regard, where we don't have a predetermined destination set out for us, but it's hard to argue against our genetic predispositions or what opportunities are available to us with how we're born. And we shouldn't lament or be distressed about what we're given, but try to utilize what we have. I think our grandfather, I really enjoyed one thing he talked about, where when he was growing up, their philosophy was just, you be happy with what you're given and get on with life. And they would talk about the three-legged dog that they had when they were younger, where the three-legged dog was just as happy as a four-legged dog and didn't seem to mind losing his limb and was having a damn good life, gleefully slobbering everywhere. And so I think in that regard, the opportunities available to us based on our genetic predisposition is something we should not lament, but leverage and focus on.
What we're talking about falls under, I believe, the section that James Clear describes as make it satisfying. So here's a quote. Quote, "The areas where you are genetically predisposed to success are the areas where habits are more likely to be satisfying. The key is to direct your effort towards areas that both excite you and match your natural skills to align your ambition with your ability." Do some people have ambition that outpaces their ability and vice versa? Do people have ability that outpaces their ambition? I think it's easier for me to picture that version than the other way around. What do you think?
Sure. I have colleagues where in their development of their mental health, they talk about ballooning and the use of the term ballooning for having their goals outpace their skills, where you say, I want to accomplish this thing. Let's just say, make a YouTube channel. And the next thing you know, you're like, well, I need a drone and a mirrorless camera, editor, and everything else. And it starts ballooning bigger and bigger than the skills or the assets that you currently have. In the same way, some people overreach when they're like, well, I want to run a marathon. So they go and they run really hard the first day and injure themselves, and then they can't run for the next week or so.
Those both sound like interesting problems to discuss, but neither of those sound like examples of ambition being outpaced by ability.
I'm glad we get to disagree.
All right. That's what the listeners are here for, disagreement. So the ballooning issue, at least the example you gave, because I haven't heard that term before used in that way.
I think the youths use it.
So used in that way, where you're talking about someone who wants to make a YouTube channel but then gets paralyzed by the fact that they've got to buy $10,000 worth of equipment and hire staff and stuff. To me, that sounds like anxiety going out of control or overthinking or paralysis by analysis. It sounds like doing a lot of stuff besides actually taking action, which is, something James Clear does talk about. Did we talk about that? Where
planning is its own form of procrastination?
Yeah. We talked about that already, right?
I believe we already discussed that.
That's a very useful way of looking at this type of situation. That, to me, seems a lot more like that. Planning as a form of procrastination and paralysis by analysis rather than your ambition is greater than your ability. Because it's not obvious in that example that someone's lacking the ability to achieve those things. They're just wallowing in something. Not quite sure what.
But the problem is I think people end up having higher goals than what their skills can achieve at the time. And they would be better off having a lower goal at their current skill level to build the skill in order to create a higher goal.
I mean, unless you are just mentally incapable of creating a YouTube channel, that person's problem is not a lack of ability. It's a lack of getting the steps done and making it into manageable steps. Same thing with the marathon. I ran really hard the first day and I couldn't do it the next day. Therefore, I can't run a marathon. I mean, maybe we can argue and say that is a lack of ability because the ability that they're lacking is planning and breaking things down into digestible steps. But even that seems to be able to be overcome.
It is able to be overcome, but the problem is you have to build the skill to achieve the ambition. But if your ambition is too grand at the time, then you'll experience failure and be uncomfortable. And then, as we know from the comfort crisis, will then shy away from that discomfort and not continue working towards those goals. I suppose I'm taking a person in mind that I have, that I see these failures in. And without expressing more about this situation, the way I see it is someone having larger ambition than their current skill set.
I guess I think I'm seeing where you're going here, but I'm having a hard time picturing, someone who is capable of running a marathon. They just need to do the proper training. They need, a few months of training and then they can get there. That seems doable and it makes sense, and they just have to break it down into bite-sized chunks.
I agree with you, but their ambition is greater than their skill set.
I mean, if they're incapable of doing the proper training, then sure, they're missing that self-control, self-discipline skill sufficient to do what needs to be done, but they're not physically or mentally incapable.
What example could you provide for us to be your ambition outpacing your skill set?
The first thing that comes to mind is, someone who rises through the ranks of an organization, and let's say the Army, for example. Let's say someone's like, you know what, I really want to be a 4-star general, but they just don't have the wherewithal and capability that makes sense for that rank, but they really want it. That would be an example that I can think of where, they have this ambition, they have this idea in mind, but they're just not cut out for it. That's something I see. You also see that in corporate America where people are sometimes really good at a tier 1 or tier 2 job. They think they want to be at, tier 3 of whatever ladder they're climbing. And then when they get there, their level of incompetence is, no longer able to be hidden or managed well at that level of ability. I believe that's called the Peter Principle, or that's related to the Peter Principle.
I don't know what the Peter Principle is, but I've heard that as the Dilbert effect, where people are promoted to their highest level of incompetence.
That's what it is, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know what the Peter Principle is. It might be the same thing. But
it's the same thing.
I've heard it as the Dilbert effect.
I like the Dilbert effect better. So that's my example.
Okay, great.
So you want to continue fleshing out your example?
No, not necessarily. In my mind, and we can
You're satisfied
happily
in your mind?
disagree.
That's
I
what
think
they're here
both-
for. They want blood,
both
guts,
are examples.
disagreement, yelling, screaming.
I'm
maybe
not
not
good
the
at screaming
You
outside
gotta
of the
keep
racquetball
volume
court.
at a normal level.
Yeah, I don't think these mics can handle that. Okay. I don't know about someone's... So that's someone's ambition outpacing their skill set. Someone's skill set outpacing their ambition, to me, just sounds like someone that doesn't have enough self-confidence to push for the higher goals that they could achieve.
Right. Yeah. Or someone who's got a PhD and is just doing their own thing rather than pursuing something specifically in their industry. But then again, that's them just playing a bigger game.
So other than someone being too humble or not having enough self-esteem and not achieving higher goals that they're capable of, I don't know of another way to look at skill set outpacing ambition.
There's people out there that are overqualified for the jobs they're doing, but that doesn't necessarily fit this. Okay, let's zoom back out to the larger point here. That was an interesting digression that was worth having. One of the things that James Clear offers up in discussing this is a list of questions that would help someone figure out where they could get the most bang for their buck as far as their strengths and predispositions. So I want to read off those questions because I think they're interesting. Okay, quote, what feels like fun to you but work to others? What makes you lose track of time? Where do you get greater returns than the average person? What comes naturally to you? So I think those are well thought out questions. I'm glad he includes those in the book. And they're really good food for thought. When you encounter these questions, did you have any thoughts or reactions to them?
My first initial thought was, in the world of martial arts, we talk about having an opponent and making them play your game, not playing their game. And the easy example is if someone is a Brazilian jiu-jitsu artist and they're really good at grappling on the ground, well, don't go to the ground with that person. Same thing with a boxer. If they're a great boxer, don't sit there and try to beat them at their game. Make them play your game. And if we were to have a physical fitness competition, Leo, I would not say, let's have a squat competition, because I'd be playing your game. Instead, I would say, Leo, let's go for a run or let's rock climb, because
rock climb, yeah.
I'd be making you play my game.
Or we could do deadlifts.
No, we can play my game. So I think utilizing your natural abilities and your current skill sets and leveraging them the best you can, these questions, I think, are a great way to focus on that. So whatever you have fun doing, you can use that in order to make your own way. And in the rescue world, we talk about how little people get paid, and that's because if there's a really fun and great job to have, people usually don't pay you a lot to do it because you want to do it anyway. And for the jobs that people really hate or don't want to do, you usually have to pay them a lot in order to incentivize them enough.
I think it was Mike in our in-person book club that made a really good point that he likes to categorize activities into two categories. Ones that he does for compensation and ones that he does not.
That's fair.
And if he does something he doesn't like, it better be in the category of getting compensated for it.
Right.
I think that's a good way of looking at it. If I have to do something I don't want to do, then I better be getting compensated for it in some way.
I guess that's a great way. And when Mike was talking about that, my reaction was, oh, well, I feel like everything I do should have a compensation. That compensation doesn't have to be monetary. But for example, working out compensates me by making me feel good, helping me have a longer and healthier life. Spending time with my loved ones in nice quality settings provides me mental and social stability, and that's compensating me in other ways besides just monetarily. Now, if I have to spend time doing something I don't want to do and I'm not getting any value out of it, then there should be that monetary compensation.
Yeah. I'm just thinking of the times that I've had to spend too much time in a DMV or tax collector's office.
And how much compensation do you really get out of that?
I pay for the privilege.
Oh, man. What makes you lose track of time? What makes you lose track of time?
Reading, for sure, reading.
It's funny that you
Working
have
out.
a book club podcast and an in-person book club.
Yeah, that's true. I'm I'm winning. I'm playing to my strengths.
Yeah, I enjoy when I get to have activities where I lose track of time. Working out is the easy one, rock climbing. I would say scuba diving, but I'm pretty acutely aware of the amount of time I'm under the water when I'm scuba diving.
That's part of it. I think that's the whole shtick.
But sometimes I think, wow, my life is so good. Time is going by too fast. And I think about what one of my trainers talked about before, where if you think life is going too fast, you should do more ab workouts, because doing 10 minutes of abs makes time go very, very slowly.
I mean, this isn't the time or place for it, but I disagree about specifically focus on abs unless you have a very, very specific thing you're doing. But anyways, it's neither here nor there.
I just wanted to bring up that saying.
That makes sense.
Great.
Yeah, do something miserable for a little while. Okay, anything else any other thoughts you have that you want to talk about? Finding your strengths and playing to your strengths, whether it comes to habits or finding what to do in life?
I think the only other question I'd add here, which is well known, is if you won the lottery, if you got a whole bunch of money, what would you do right now? And that's another question I think kind of opens up the mentality of, well, what would you truly want to spend your time on?
I mean, after the partying, it would be doing basically what I'm doing right now.
Working out and reading.
Working out and reading. Hanging out with my book club friends and doing this here podcast. Hanging out with my family.
You must like disagreeing.
Playing D&D every weekend with my friends. Yeah, that kind of stuff.
It's fair.
Disagreeing?
Yeah.
Why do you say that?
Because you want to disagree today, and I don't know why.
What did I just disagree about?
You didn't. I was just thinking of the things that you would do even if you won the lottery.
Oh, yeah.
Disagree would still be there.
Yeah, disagree would still be on there, for sure. For sure.
Okay. So with that, also in chapter 19, we'll go through a couple of the other quotes, which I think are pretty useful.
Stay close to the mic. You're wondering. Yep. Quotes on chapter 19. Here we go. Quote, mastery requires practice. The more you practice something, the more boring and routine it becomes. And then this pairs well with another quote in here. Quote, the only way to become excellent is to be endlessly fascinated by doing the same thing over and over. You have to fall in love with boredom. Okay? So mastery requires practice, but the more you practice something, the more boring and routine it becomes. What do you think about that?
We started to get into this in the first part of this episode, where we talked about the journey versus the destination, or being in love with doing the journey rather than just the end result. And we brought up hiking, working out, things of that nature. But I do agree with this. The more you do something, the more routine it becomes, and the less dopamine results you get from it, because it's the same activity. It's our brain saying, well, we've picked from the same berry bush for long enough. It's time to move on. I'm tired of this. Even though you've gotten so good at knowing the whole bush and where everything's at. But you have to build those routine, almost mundane and rudimentary, boring aspects in order to create mastery above that. Playing the guitar, for example, your fingers have to automatically know how to play certain notes, certain progressions and scales before you can start to create complex things, because those need to be on the back of the brain where you don't even have to think about it. Dancing is another great one. Your feet have to learn the basics. I mean, you learned how to dance. I learned how to dance. Yeah. And so before you can do all the cool fancy moves, your feet have to be automatically doing the right steps at the right timing before you can get into the complex stuff. But then when you go back to, okay, now we're going to practice the basic step again, you're bored because you've already mastered that. You've squeezed all the dopamine out of that tube of toothpaste.
I agree for the most part with these quotes. Something becoming boring and routine, but also being fascinated by that boredom, falling in love with the boredom. I get those things. That to me, that makes sense. But I don't know. Let me think about that for a second. I guess part of it is that, stuff that's truly fascinating and interesting. And now I do remember us talking about this, but it bears getting back into. So, for example, doing the same workout in and out, in and out, in and out, over and over and over and over and over. There is an element of boredom to that. but it's sufficiently challenging enough that there's a mental component to it. It's not easy. Doing the workout itself is not easy. Therefore, I don't know, it's not boring. I'm trying to think of another example. Running gets boring, but then same thing. I just increase the difficulty in one way, change one of the variables to make it appropriately challenging, either mentally or physically.
To be fair, though, you have a higher resistance to boredom for doing the same task again and again than the average person.
Yeah, I am.
There's
personality-wise predisposed to routine.
So you're playing into your own strengths by being able to do the same thing again and again and enjoy this minute changes therein. Other people, though, your program wouldn't work for them because they just don't have the predisposition to have that type of routine. And so other people thrive better in, I've never been, but what people have told me from Orange Theory or other things where you go and you're doing roughly the same types of workout, but they're different maneuvers, different movements that are still using the same muscle groups. But because it's a slightly different thing or you use a different name for it, their brain can latch onto it easier.
That's a good point, and that's something that comes up a lot when discussing, how to help a training client, stay consistent. If in a perfect world, you would give them, the most optimal, efficient program to improve whatever they're trying to improve. It's usually strength that fuels everything else, but that would be the best. Like give them just the most efficient program. But the most efficient program for most people, like you're saying, is boring. It is very routine. It is very boring, even though there are variables that are changing workout to workout and then later on week to week and month to month. It's boring. And there's certain personalities which work well with that. And there's other personalities where it would help them stay consistent in the long run and help them be more successful in the long term if you introduced a little bit more novelty and change and alternatives that may not be the most efficient or productive, but it keeps them mentally and emotionally engaged. So that makes sense to me. That's something that definitely comes up with personal training. The program that works for you needs to also be something you can be consistent with. It doesn't matter how good the program is. If you can't be consistent,
it'll never work.
It's just not going to work. And consistency is the number one variable.
And I think a more base example that just came to me is when we took our 24-day road trip from Florida to the Grand Canyon, we didn't have a lot of money to spare at the time. So we created our own protein bars at the time, and we created sheets and sheets of these protein bars that were basically, in our mind, like elven bread from Lord of the Rings, where what we put in it made them stay good for a long time, didn't have to be refrigerated, and it had a high enough calorie count that we could rely on it so that we didn't have to buy a lot of food. And I forget what day it was, our younger brother very quickly disparaged ever having to eat it again, would rather starve than eat it. And we still had many sheets left. And at some point I was like, I can't. I'd rather eat the grass on the side of the road than this anymore. And you even got to a point during those 24 days where you're like, I can't eat the same thing again.
Yeah, it happened. And it happened in that order.
So I think our bodies and our minds, there's a whole bunch of shades, and I think you're closer towards enjoying the routine more than another person, but our brains ultimately are wired to want novelty because novelty typically means the capability to survive or reproduce better or more efficiently. I think one of the examples I read was if you're picking a berry bush, at some point you get bored. Your brain makes you get bored to move on to the next berry bush because you have to increase the amount of effort to get a decreased amount of resources, i.e. you've already picked most of the berries. Time to move on. So it would be nice, though, training yourself in order to improve your routine, but you got to make it work for you. And in my case, I like the working out and everything, but I don't stay every Monday. I do exactly these 3 workouts. I have a list of a whole bunch of workouts and I get them done throughout the whole week. just depending on whatever I feel like, and I mix it up, but it's the exact same movements. For you, I'm sure in your perfect world, you would do exactly the same workout every Monday at this time.
That would be nice, but it doesn't work out that way.
So you got to make it work for you.
Another thought here, we're talking about falling in love with boredom, and we had a really good discussion in the in-person book club group where the underlying mentality underneath, the thoughts fueling these quotes of mastery and falling in love with boredom and pursuing excellence assumes that you want to constantly be improving. You want to reach a level of mastery above and beyond where you're at right now. And that may be true for very specific facets of your life or things you're pursuing. But in general, we don't necessarily need mastery, That's not an imperative. That's something, if someone wants to pursue, they can pursue it. But I believe it was Jessica who pointed out, in a tongue-in-cheek way, she aims for complacency, meaning that in the context of this discussion, it's okay not to be a master at everything. It's okay to not constantly be pursuing the self-improvement. Sometimes good enough is just good enough. You don't have to get to such a point of like being keyed up and working on something that boredom's even there. You don't have to even get to the boredom point sometimes. It just depends on what you're doing and what you're pursuing. If you're trying to reach the most upper echelons of some corporate ladder or some organizational ladder, then you probably do need to get to the point where you are grinding to where you're fighting against boredom. But otherwise, in most instances, that's not something you got to be working against.
Yeah. What does it matter? At the end of the day, what does it matter?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Let's take a quick bathroom break and then jump in to the next set of notes we have here.
And we're back, and we're going to finish the little bit that we have on atomic habits.
Okay, so reflecting on the downside of forming and improving habits, the author explores an argument that a mastered habit could turn into a form of complacency. Quote, "The downside of habits is that you get used to doing things a certain way and stop paying attention to little errors. You assume you're getting better because you're gaining experience. In reality, you are merely reinforcing your current habits, not improving them." End quote. I have several thoughts here. You start.
I know that I keep going back to this, but it's part of my background that I've done for so many years. But doing martial arts, we talk about forming habits in terms of doing the kihon, or basically, in other words, for other arts, the katas, and you build these habits. But when you do them, you stop paying attention to them, and your foot works a little bit wrong, your hand works a little bit wrong, or your positioning is slightly off. And so the only way to fix those, at least what my instructor's philosophy was, is you kind of have to build that habit and then break that habit by learning better habits to overcome them. So we would do things where during some classes we would say, okay, we're going to do the first kata or chino kata. And when we do that, we would go slowly, bit by bit, even if every single person in there was a black belt in the class. We would go so slow over the basics to look at those minute details that we overlook and get rid of the errors that we've created just because we stop paying attention to it when we do more complex movements.
What you're describing in the barbell training world is what I know as what's called form creep. So there are very specific ways to perform certain barbell movements, and there's very specific forms, even down to like where your intentions should be. It gets a little esoteric, but there's physiological, purposes behind them. Even down to like where you should, what part of your body should be exerting the effort for a movement. An example would be in a deadlift. So in a deadlift, it is very helpful to think about pushing the ground away, and whether or not you are doing that in your head is not necessarily visible. It is probably visible to a master level coach, but the idea, like if you're holding into your head, like the idea of push the ground away, it orients your body and your muscles in such a way to perform the movement in a very specific way to make it happen. And so there's very, very specific things to work on. So what you're describing, the barbell version of it, form creep, would be if you're working out in isolation. Like I don't always have someone to work out with me. Most of my workouts are alone. And even though I know what the proper form is, me just working out on my own, let's say I start off with perfect form, 6 months later, if I don't have a way of doing checkups and balances and basically quality control, then my form will creep. My squat will slowly deviate out of proper form in a few different ways. So yeah, I could have the habit of the most perfect squat form, but without kind of checking in on it and checking up on it, it will creep. It's inevitable.
So what you're saying is you agree with James Clear that sometimes when things become routine, that complacency will lead to kind of a drifting trajectory away from great.
I think it can. Yeah, I think it can in a lot of ways. Regardless of the habit or the daily routine, I think that's a very good point. Like, it becomes automatic. The brain, they've done studies where the more mastered a skill is, the less and less brain areas that light up when you're executing that skill. So when you first learn to drive, if you were hooked up to a machine that could monitor what your brain's doing and how much it's lighting up, there would be a lot of activity and it would be very bright. Many areas would be lit up. Fast forward 10 years of regular driving on an empty highway with not, almost no one else around, that brain activity is much, much, much lower, because you've mastered that skill to the point where it's almost in the automatic areas of the brain. You know what you need to be doing with your hands, with your eyes, with your body, it's all automatic. So it's easy to think that, once you achieve a certain level of skill with a habit or a certain level of routine with a habit, that, okay, it just stays that way. But that's not the case. Because it's going more and more into the automatic side of the brain, you have less attention and intention on it. Therefore, it's not being monitored. Therefore, there's no guardrails really to keep it from going astray. So why would it not go astray? It's entropy.
Yeah, sure. I mean, your brain's going to put less energy towards tasks it can automate. Our brain is constantly trying to automate as much as it can. It's a pretty efficient machine where it tries to reduce its workload at all times.
Law of least effort.
Yeah.
And then that also goes back to, sometimes good enough is good enough. And, trying to think of an example skill, but just take a habit or a skill you've achieved, you get it to a certain level of mastery, and then it starts degrading. Well, it's still within that good enough range until that level of degradation reaches a point where it's noticeable or you're starting to have a noticeable performance slip.
Sure. I think washing dishes or making my morning coffee, those are automated. I don't have to think about how do I make the coffee anymore or how do I wash these dishes. It becomes so automated, and whether I produce the coffee at 100% of my skill or 60% of my skill, at the end of the event, I just have a hot cup of bean juice.
Yeah, and good enough is good enough in those instances.
Good enough is going to be good enough. Same with driving. Other than when I had to drive the ambulance, I don't feel a desire to improve my driving skill. I'm fine with it being automated while my brain listens to a podcast and gets to engage in other ways.
Right. And the potential margin of error for screwing up or skill degradation is different in all those categories.
Sure.
You get, how much worse can you get at making a cup of coffee once you've mastered making a cup of coffee? Just not much,
So complacency is good for certain things. I would say whenever I had someone that was trying to achieve a goal, whether I was teaching the martial arts or doing scuba or rock climbing or caving, sometimes complacency is good, like in making coffee. But whenever I'd go scuba diving with less experienced people than me and I had to teach them things, I would never teach them complacency. You should never be complacent in that. You should always check your gear. You should never just assume that yesterday's regulator was working, so why do I need to check it now? Let me just get the gear on. Absolutely not. Very much anti-complacency in these fields.
It's the same. That's the same mentality with handling firearms. Never, ever, ever think that a gun's not loaded. Even if you unloaded a gun yourself, you've emptied it, it doesn't have a magazine in it, you still a rule that you follow is never point a gun at something you don't intend to destroy.
Right.
Even if you know with certainty the gun's empty, you just don't point it at something that you don't intend to destroy.
Right.
Like, it's never pointed at another person. And then same thing with loading and unloading the gun. You take a gun from your friend's hand that you just watched him unload, you still need to go through the process of triple checking that it is not loaded, there's not a bullet in the chamber.
And I think when we're looking at these things, each person can make their own judgment call on what skills should be complacent and automatic. And honestly, for many people, you don't even have to think about it. That becomes a habit or action in it of itself. But I forget what part of the book, but James Clear talks about the Japanese rail system.
That's exactly what I was thinking about.
And they do the call-out method, where as they're approaching a station or as a train's leaving a station, the conductor or the safety officer, whoever,
all of them,
that everyone involved, they are supposed to point at the thing and call it out. So the easiest example is when the train is coming into the station, the conductor has to point at it and say out loud what the speed is. And that makes it come to the forefront of the brain. So
strong anti-complacency tactics.
Right. And I think that's very imperative in skills or fields where we want to ensure our safety or our improved skill. And I think that's something I need to incorporate in my own life a little bit better, about bringing to the forefront, calling out whatever it is that I'm doing.
One thing that having my first child and watching her grow over the past couple months is bringing to light is like, even though she's not really understanding the words I'm saying yet, I narrate a lot of the stuff that I'm doing, and that has the interesting effect of bringing a lot of stuff to the forefront. I will be carrying her through the house in the morning while I'm going throughout the morning routine. Okay, I'm pulling down this cup. I am doing this. I am adding water to this because of this. And I'm just narrating it for her so she can hear the words and she can get used to hearing the words. And also so I'm in the practice of narrating through what's happening so she can eventually learn what all this stuff is explicitly as well as implicitly. But that has the same exact, it's kind of an involuntarily like calling out naming effect that's making me, see that stuff in the forefront or begin to see it in a new facet. And just in general, a zoomed out version of that, thinking through stuff in the coming years that I want to explain. Like, okay, I have to explain what a checkbook is and how to write a check and why we do this and why we do that and all these different things. And I have to think about, going through and explaining it to essentially an alien who's come to Earth and doesn't know anything about what's going on. Like, how would I explain it to an alien? Well, us humans, we do, this because of this, because of this. Here's why. So it's a very interesting thought exercise.
Yeah. So is there anything else you want to talk about with complacency or...
Yeah, I want to look at this quote a little bit more. So he's talking about the downsides of habits, and this is in the context of a book that's all about habits and how making tiny changes can add up to compounding interest of big changes in your life. So he's adding this in here to contrast and add more information. I don't think he's turning around and saying, well, actually habits are bad. That's obviously not the point of what he's doing here. But let's look at this quote one more time. So the downside of habits is that you get used to doing things a certain way and stop paying attention to little errors. You assume you're getting better because you're gaining experience. In reality, you are merely reinforcing your current habits, not improving them. End quote. And it's that last part that I want to circle back on the not improving them. This goes back to sometimes good enough is good enough, and complacency in certain areas is fine. You don't always need to be improving. If you can maintain your habits at a certain level that accomplishes the goals that you want in life or accomplishes what you need, I don't think you need to constantly be improving. Again, that's just something that I see throughout the book. There's this kind of constant implicit philosophy of always improving. And for me, that's just something I want to contrast a little bit and be intentional about when I'm adopting that mindset and when I'm not. So I think that's it. I think that's the only other thing I wanted to talk about there.
Great.
Okay. Ready to move on?
I'm ready.
Okay. This is still in the context of talking about the downsides of habits. Here's another quote. Quote, "The more sacred an idea is to us, that is, the more deeply it is tied to our identity, the more strongly we will defend it against criticism." What do you think about this idea here?
I think whenever our identity is threatened, we oftentimes rebel against that most heartedly because it threatens who we are as an individual. The most extreme examples we can look at cults, and anything that threatens the identity of that cult, people will rebel against that even stronger, regardless of the validity or objectivity of that criticism.
And I think there's two things to talk about here. I think, there's our relationship with criticism and when criticism feels threatening or not. And like what he's pointing out here in this quote is the closer to home criticism feels, the more threatening it feels, the more strongly we'll react to it in a visceral way. If I said, "Joel, you're bad at making cakes," then you're going to be like, "Okay, well, that's sure. Okay." You're not going to have much of a reaction to that. But if I said, "Joel, your martial arts are crappy," you're going to have more of a visceral reaction to that and a more of a knee-jerk reaction because that's something that's a little bit closer to your identity,
Sure. I think along the same lines, one of the inverses here is in a marriage book I was reading. It talks about...
In a what?
In a marriage book.
Okay.
I was reading, it talks about communicating. And in one of the examples, it's discussing how close it is to the person's identity that you're talking about and how they'll react to it. So, for example, saying, "I hate when you leave dirty dishes in the sink" is a different adversarial approach to saying, "I hate dirty dishes in the sink," right? There's a connection to the other person where they almost feel like they have to defend themselves.
I've also heard that described as, if it's a problem you're talking about, use language that describes it. Use I statements. So, in the dirty dishes example, you could, say, "Hey, when there's dirty dishes in the sink, it makes me feel like the house is a mess," or it makes me feel, disorganized, or it makes me feel a lack of control. And you're using I statements about what you're feeling, and it's keeping it there. Whereas you're not pointing a finger at the other person and saying, "When you leave dirty dishes in the sink, I feel blah,
Right.
blah, 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 blah." It completely changes the accusation there and the way that person perceives that. Same thing with the criticism. There's better and worse ways to give criticism, but there's also, regardless of how someone's sending the criticism over your way, there's a lot you can do, I think, on your end to manipulate how you're receiving it. So let's say someone comes to you and they're griping, they're upset, they've got some criticism, they're pointing fingers, and they're delivering it badly. If you can recognize that they're delivering it badly, you can kind of keep your calm and you can hunt down the hidden, okay, what's the useful takeaway of what this person is saying? Like, "Oh, you're such a bad blah, 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 blah," doing whatever. And it helps me in situations like that if I can, one, identify that they're trying to express something, they're not doing a good job of it, and there is most likely something useful underneath here. So let me, go another step and try to ignore the noise and get the signal underneath that. Okay, they're saying Okay, here's the takeaway. Dishes. I need to do better. Getting the dishes out of the sink faster. Whatever it is.
So gracious of you.
Now you got to do what you got to do.
Yeah, I think in interpersonal relationships, more care and effort is taken, or should be taken, to avoid that identity criticism, but rather the behavior criticism, or the object that's the problem.
And I think what helps a lot in the context that we're talking about here in relationships, but also in the context of habits and criticisms and stuff tied to our identity, all of this revolves around behavior and behavior change. If there is a problem or issue that is causing friction or upset in a relationship, or with your relationship with yourself, or your relationship with your habits, the underlying thing that you're really wanting to address is a change in behavior. And keeping it focused on behavior, just in my experience, has really helped not have wasted upset time, upset frustration in conversations like that, and helped resolve, okay, what can I do right now? Let's say I'm unhappy with my sleep hygiene, okay? Rather than waste time on being upset about that, it helps me feel like I have a plan of action and a solution if I focus on what are the behaviors I can be doing right now to make this better. That immediately helps quash, distress I may be feeling about that. Same thing in like the dishes situation. Okay, there's a lot of emotion going on here. There's a lot of upset. There's all this, but underneath it all, what is the behavior change that could be affected by one or both parties that would improve the situation and reduce the pain? And for me, it's just behavior. Focus on behavior change. What needs to be changed?
Sure. So with that, why is it you think we have such a explosive reaction to criticism, especially for criticism that might be threatening to our identity?
We talked about this previously in the in-person book club podcast, and the in-person book club, and there was a lot of really good discussions around it. For me, I find Ernest Becker's argument pretty compelling, and that the fear of death has something to do here. So when you're receiving criticism and it's hurtful because it's landing close to home, that's not just saying, oh, you're being a bad friend or a bad employee. That's also threatening your livelihood and your ability to be a part of a group, or your ability to, continue to survive. It is in a way threatening to your survival if you feel like it's landing right at your identity. Like, oh, well, if I'm bad at doing this aspect of my job, there's a narration that goes on underneath, then I must be a bad employee, therefore I'm an unfit human, therefore, my survival's threatened. So it makes sense. Same thing with rejection. Rejection in some ways can be looked at as a form of criticism, and rejection hurts so bad because you feel that threat at a fundamental level. Like, it is an existential feeling, oh, life itself is rejecting me. Well, no, that person just didn't want to deal with you right then and there, Not the same thing, but we don't feel that at a fundamental level. We feel the threat. So that's for me why I think we react so strongly to criticism, is because we find it threatening on a very fundamental level.
I like the word there, existential. We have an existential threat whenever we feel rejection. And that can come in many different forms. But like you're saying, if someone is, say, a bad friend, right, they feel the rejection, although the words aren't directly there, it's interpreted as, I'm a bad friend, so I'm being rejected from this friendship. That can easily lead to not a direct slope, but like a subconscious slope of, oh, I'm being rejected from society, therefore other people will reject me. I won't find a mate. I'm not lovable. It can spiral into this huge, like you're saying, existential problem where you feel no good at all.
Yeah. And then that circles back to, behavior. Okay, here's all this upset and frustration around the situation. Here's how it made me feel. But then what behavior can I change or add into my life that will reduce the likelihood of me feeling this again?
Right. And I do think this is a feature of the human psyche because many, many years ago, to be rejected from a group, because we only lived in small groups, would be tantamount to death. We have an extremely hard time living on our own as animals. We are a social animal. So I think having that visceral reaction to rejection is innate to us as human beings.
Right. It's not just in your head. It is, it could potentially be an existential issue.
So I think we already talked about it, but in giving criticism, it's best, from my experience, it's best to give that criticism removing the person and only talking about the object or the habit or the end result. Sometimes you do have to talk about, or directly to the person, saying your blah, blah, blah personality trait is bad in nicer, more flowery language. But rather, like you were saying, I feel upset with the dishes being dirty, not I'm upset that you left the dishes being dirty. So making it less personal and less direct, I think, would be
less
the best way.
adversarial too. Another way I like to think about it is put us on the same side of the table rather than on opposite sides of the table.
Right.
Let's work on this problem together rather than I have a problem with you doing X, Y, and Z. No, we have an issue because I'm bothered by X, Y, and Z. Like, what can we do to help me not be upset about X, Y, and Z? Or what can we do about this issue I'm having rather than you're the issue? It just changes what seat you're in at the table.
Right. I also use we statements when I'm talking with business partners or people I'm working with, just to make it easier. We are working on this project to achieve this. When it's a client, even though the client's not literally doing work, I use the word we to make it sound like a team-oriented idea, to say, hey, we're together on this. We're not fighting each other.
Right. Keeps you on the same side of the table and keeps both of you oriented on the goal.
Great.
Yeah, I'm looking through my notes here and I'm not really seeing much out. I think we kind of covered everything that I wanted to talk about. I mean, again, my main takeaway from the book is that quote, every action you take is a vote for the person you want to become. I mean, that is, for me, in the context of what we were just talking about, that's behavior, focusing on what behavior you can add in or change or tweak.
Sure.
Can have big results. James Clear likes to use the language of compounding interest. That doesn't resonate with me all that much, but I get the point, and that doesn't take away from the effectiveness of that quote. What about you? What is your main takeaway here?
So I'm going to give you all of my main takeaways from this book in a short, truncated version, and that is, like you said, the voting. Every action is a vote for the person you want to be. That's a takeaway, and that is a nice, useful, almost mantra whenever I'm about to make a decision. To be like, okay, well, I have some free time now. I finished my work. I want to relax. Do I pick up the game controller, or do I pick up my pencil and start studying a language I'm working on?
Or do you pick up that book so you can get all your reading done for book club?
Or do I pick up the book and read? And again, none of those things are wrong. It's not wrong, morally wrong, or anything to play a game or to read a book or to study a language, but voting on who I want to be at that time. And in different instances, each one can be the correct answer.
That does two things that occur to me. It changes it from the default puritanical guilt that I think is in our society to, that's a stick, and it changes it to a carrot. Like, oh, I get to choose, who I want to be with this next action. Who do I want to vote for, emerging in the future version of myself with my next couple actions. So yeah, carrots instead of sticks. And then the other thing you're doing is, we are bound by the present. We can't visit the future and the past, and we're only slowly moving from present to future. And whenever it's the future, it's actually just the present. So we're very time bound but thinking in that way of, an behavior action oriented path to your future self helps you see the future in a narrative way that is really easy for our brains to grasp.
Yeah. I think it's easy to take it to this moment and make the decisions for the person you want to be.
Okay, what are your other takeaways?
The other one, kind of in the same line as that 1%, which for me is, hey, it's okay if your progress is very little or very slow. I think this will especially help people trying to work out. Be okay with not big results real quick, but rather just try to be just a tiny bit better and take the pressure off of yourself that you have to be great fast. So that's a nice one because consistency is going to produce better results in the long run than a few short leaps at the beginning.
Right. Is that it? You got more?
I'm trying to finish them up. The other one, the 2-minute rule. I also am going to take away the 2-minute rule.
Oh yeah, 2-minute rule.
Because that was a really good one, and it goes on the same line as the 1% mentality for me, which is...
Remind us what the 2-minute rule is.
Whatever the habit you're trying to change or create, make it that it can be done in less than 2 minutes. The example being, if you want to run, instead of saying, I'll run a mile, you say, I'll put on my running shoes and go out the door. That less than 2 minutes is that vote to begin with, that decision point that you're more likely to follow through with what you want. All right. And then the last one I'm going to take away here, and I'll leave it at this, is when James Clear talks about we're not going to rise to our goals, but we're going to fall to our systems. So setting in the 2-minute rules, having low goals to start with, just so that you're at 1% better, and making each little moment a small vote in the direction that you want to progress in. All of those things are these small little systems that eventually will add up to you achieving what you want, or you progressing to be the person that you want to be. So take the decision in yourself, take the locus of control and put it inside of yourself, make good decisions, and create those systems for yourself.
Okay. That is a great place to end on. Good note to end.
All
So with that wraps up our discussion of Atomic Habits. Again, I'm Leo. That's Joel. And we will be back next episode with a new book. Not sure which one we're going to cover next. If we'll pull one from the archives, it will be a little bit more concurrent with the in-person book club. But until then, please send us your comments, your corrections, your thoughts, feelings to deepdivebookclub@gmail.com. Where are we? What's our Instagram?
Or you can also message us on Instagram, and I will be looking at the Instagram, and it's just Deep Dive Book Club on Instagram. So send us messages. We would love to hear from you, and we would love for you to read along with us and tell us if you get to take anything away and incorporate it into your life.
All right. See you guys next time.
All right. See you next time.